Well, folks, that's it. Star Wars has officially run out of good content. I'm joking, and I don't want to be one of those people who's so pessimistic and constantly has to remind you of how much they hate popular content. But to be fair, it's going to be very difficult to top or even meet Andor going forward. This series has been a hell of a ride, with more technical and thematic bravery than most recent TV. A likable set of actors for some subtle yet exciting characters in a world which has experienced further development in this single 2-season Disney Plus spinoff than in any project in its universe in the last 10 years. I feel pretty confident saying that. The thing is, I can't really say Andor ended with a bang. I'm not disappointed by these episodes, but it very clearly isn't meant to be the end of this series. Rogue One is the end of Cassian Andor's arc, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, let's focus on the conclusions to our Andor-specific characters and how Cassian has built throughout the season. Our first episode focuses on something that most Andor fans saw coming before we even saw the trailer: the fall of Luthen Rael. Luthen has been an obvious death from the start, as he teases in each passing episode that he knows he won't make it to see the rebellion win. This final episode for Luthen is a showcasing of his devotion, his cruelty, and his reason. In this episode, we learn Luthen was an Imperial defector himself, which makes perfect sense given his character. Luthen has used Imperial techniques to control his rebellion, and he's always been more brutal than any other hero on the Force. He simply uses these things for good, not evil. He's not exactly a good man, and he does not have good roots, but he does have good intentions. This backstory explains why Luthen tactically works the way he does. It also connects him to Kleya, who gets a strangely dramatic rise to being practically the deuteragonist of these last 3 episodes. Through flashbacks, we learn that Kleya has essentially no life outside of helping Luthen. Her entire family is dead, and he had adopted her ever since. When Dedra captures Luthen, Kleya acts in the fashion of a cog, still controlled by her leader despite him being reserved to a hospital bed. She barely speaks, she simply acts, and it's clear that her mind is lagging behind her body. I'll admit, I personally don't find Kleya to be quite as interesting as most of our main cast, simply because a lot of the writing for her seems to push her into the limelight a little too much for it to not stick out, but none of this criticism applies to Elizabeth Dulau. Maybe she's not Stellan Skarsgård, but this is literally her first role ever, and she is expressing so much charisma and panic simultaneously. I think my biggest issue with this whole arc is the fact that when Kleya reaches Luthen, who has stabbed himself and is being held on life support, she simply disengages his life support, and that's it. I understand, again, that this story is based in realism, but just like with Cinta, that extra moment would have been so meaningful. Even just a simple look of recognition between Luthen and Kleya would have impacted me so much more than him basically exhaling and then dying without even opening his eyes. I don't need much, but I need something considering how much context was just added to their relationship. The fact that we don't get a single beat between them after learning all that was somewhat disappointing. Finally, after episode 10, in episode 11, we get our boy Cassian. Our first scene of Cassian Andor himself is just a simple game of cards between him, Melshi, and K2SO, already showing us that the point of this section of the story is to build into Rogue One. And when it comes to this scene, the synergy is really off the charts. I think it runs on a little too long, but I didn't find K2 to be at all forced as comic relief. I actually feel like he, as someone who is continuously questioning Cassian's tactics in this arc, really shows how far he has grown from the more careful and worried man that he was in Season 1. Cassian, after learning that Luthen is in trouble from the Rebel Alliance, speaks words which are so meaningful, remarking that it doesn't even matter if it's a trap to him considering how much Luthen means to the rebellion. Of all people, the man with 1,000 cover stories is about to walk straight into a situation he very well knows could get him killed in service of the rebellion, and that is what has changed throughout this season. In Season 1, we see Cass become a rebel. In Season 2, we see Cass become a leader. Cassian, Melshi, and Kay are able to successfully retrieve Kleya, despite me pretty much being certain that her run was up and that the message was simply going to be passed through Cassian. Kleya is hospitalized on Yavin, the rebel base, and we get a set of debates building towards action on the part of the rebels. Cass transmits Kleya's information, and Episode 12, instead of being a massive fight, ends up mostly just being an argument between the rebel group over whether they should trust Luthen's information. Mon, who has finally chosen to go proactive and to cut off her hair, is actually willing to trust the information, especially after Cass's impassioned speech about Luthen, which I love. It might just be my scene of the episode. Cassian is speaking to people who are so certain that Luthen was an extremist, outlandish fool trying to convince them that his information will save mankind. My very favorite line from this episode comes when Cass asks if anybody in the room outside of Mon had ever even spoken to Luthen. Yes, Luthen was chaotic, but not a single person was close enough to know how calculated and devoted he was. Rebellions require big steps, and you're often met by people who don't understand that. People who are careful and always looking out for themselves, just like Cassian was in our first season. It's a fantastic parallel. After this, we get a few scenes to wrap up Vel Sartha, who is asked by Mon to talk to Cassian to pry out the truth. Vel is very blunt and understanding of Luthen by this point, so she doesn't even really need to ask Cassian. Instead, they simply have a toast to all the people they've lost over the years, and Vel approves of him. Afterwards, she has a very quick scene that I like even more with Kleya, which perfectly finishes their small yet important relationship throughout the series. Vel has never truly been able to see how much Kleya has done for the Rebel Alliance, but now, after all this, she can see, and she has to act as support for the first time. She does so simply and beautifully by leading Kleya out of the rain and speaking the only line that I think really challenges Cassian's, flipping the saying from Gorman, "I have friends everywhere," into "you're with friends now." Vel and Kleya have been living in chaos and uncertainty for years and years, never having anybody around them see and feel what they are going through except Cinta and Luthen, both of which are no longer here. The fact that the two of them can look in each other's eyes and recognize each other to be strong-willed, important members of an incredibly necessary force is a bigger win for the rebellion than any heist ever could be. Yavin itself, as a point of reconvening and discussing plans as one massive force, ends up being so helpful for the rebellion to close out the last couple wins in this season. The Empire, on the other hand, the Empire is falling apart. Probably my favorite detail about this arc in its entirety is how aggressively the Empire loses without you really noticing. It seems like a small thing for a woman like Kleya to escape their grasp, but it's the idea that goes with it. The Death Star is out now, and not only that, but the force of the Empire shrivels in these 3 episodes. Every major character to die is part of the Empire. The most obvious is Hirt, who gets used as a meat shield by K2SO. Then there's Lonnie and Luthen, both Rebel members, but were originally Empire loyalists, and both were needed alive for the Empire's victory. Then there's Partagaz, who painfully shoots himself after Kleya escapes, knowing that his reign is essentially over, as his failure to keep the Death Star secret will certainly result in his imprisonment. And finally, Dedra, who is not as self-aware as Partagaz and too prideful to off herself. Dedra, who has always been breaking the Empire norm. Dedra, the only woman in the room that nobody wants to listen to. Dedra, who bent the rules just once because not a single person would admire her talent, is thrown into a jail cell for that. Dedra's mistake wasn't even major. Yes, it got Luthen killed, but he would have offed himself in some way no matter how many guards were on duty. And if he couldn't, he never would have broken. It's Luthen. They were never getting anything out of him. Despite this, I feel like the Empire was always looking for a reason to put Dedra away. She was a loyalist and a fascist, but she was different and defiant. In hindsight, it makes perfect sense that the woman with so much confidence in her own ability and need to acquire power would be silenced before she could get too high in the ranks. Every person that the Empire needed to live either perished or fell badly, while every rebel managed to survive this arc except for 2 being the only 2 with major connections to the opposing force. You have to admit, it's incredibly smart. In the end, the rebellion will act on Luthen's information. Cassian receives word from a plant on Saw Gerrera's planet of an Imperial defector, leading us directly into Rogue One. Cass gathers his group and delivers one meaningful nod to the Force healer who predicted his worth in Episode 7. He's finally the leader we see in the movie. Then, we cut to our last scene. Bix, Bimo, and Talia, Brasso's wife, are safely located on Mina Rao, far out of the Empire's reach. Bix has her own child, likely Cassian's, and she is living peacefully. The final shot is Bix looking into the sky. This is who gets to see the sunrise, and this is who was supposed to see the sunrise from the beginning. And that's a wrap. Andor's last arc was not my favorite, I'll say, as there was a lot more that I think could have happened that didn't. I'm very much satisfied with Cassian's arc's ending, but I think that there are multiple other people on the show with more story to tell. Vel, for one, has been written very well in every arc she has, but her conclusion feels like just another day in a longer life. Willman, who somehow made it out of this story alive, feels to be only beginning his rebellion, and Clea has just become relevant in the last 3 episodes. Dare I say a spin-off focusing on the characters on Yavin? I know that a spin-off directly goes against the whole point of this show in a way, but you can't blame me for wanting to see more of these incredible people, and if it's Tony Gilroy behind it, you'd be there, admit it. Now, here comes the big question. Does this show make Rogue One better in retrospect? With all this added context, is the much more Star Wars-y 2016 movie that started and ended all of this any better than it was on release? I watched it last night, and the answer is, yeah, a little. Rogue One definitely didn't have enough time to make me feel for that group as much as I cared for the people in Andor, and the tone is a little all over the place, but I do feel like I get the point the film is trying to make more so, and context was never gonna hurt. I mean, when he said that he'd been in this fight since he was 6 years old, he wasn't fucking joking. As this season comes to a close, I'll give its final arc an 8.5 out of 10, and the season as a whole an 8.5 as well. I honestly enjoyed Season 1 more, just because it felt more like a freer story, but this season was far from a disappointment, and I'd give both seasons of Andor combined a solid 9. It's very, very, very good, and very satisfying too. Bye now.